corruption is, and the growth of corruption and the complexity of the systems that have been created to enable corruption, both in the autocratic world and now in the democratic world. It's happening very spectacularly right now in the United States. That is going to be something that impoverishes people.
Welcome to Thinkers on Times Radio, the show where big ideas come along. We try and spend a bit of time and a little bit of nuance, have a conversation about the ideas that are shaping the world with some of the sharpest minds doing the thinking about that shaping. Today's guest is Anne Applebaum, Pulitzer Prize-winning historian, author, among other books, of Autocracy, Inc., which explores how authoritarian regimes around the world are increasingly interconnected, from Putin to Xi. Political figures in democratic countries as well may be adopting something of their approach. Is autocracy becoming an exportable idea, the dominant idea, perhaps, of the modern times? It's an important question. It can be quite a troubling question, and I'd like to say that Anne Applebaum joins us now to explore it. Anne, good morning to you.
Good morning.
So, this is quite gloomy, Anne, isn't it? The idea that the world is being carved up by men. It's always men. Men with not similar ideologies, but similar approaches to power.
Yes, so my book describes something that is not a bloc, it's not an alliance, it's not even a group of people who meet secretly in a back room somewhere. It's not like a James Bond movie where they all sit around a table and decide things. Instead, what's happened is the emergence of a group of dictatorships who share interests. They don't have the same ideology. So we're talking about nationalist Russia and communist China and theocratic Iran and Bolivarian socialist Venezuela. And they've simply begun to share things. So they have a similar attitude towards money and finance. Most of the leaders of these countries, unlike dictators in the more distant past, are very rich people. They are billionaires. We don't necessarily know how or why they became billionaires, but they're very wealthy, and they keep their money hidden. They have untransparent systems that don't let us see where it's coming from. But they've also learned to hide and move their money around the world secretly, and they've done so often with the cooperation of Western financial institutions. That's one of the themes of the book. They've also begun to collaborate around for autocratic narratives. So the idea that democracy is weak and divided, that autocracy is stable and safe, that there is some kind of traditional hierarchy that they are defending against the degeneracy of the democratic world. This is also an idea that they share with one another and with others in the democratic world. And they've also collaborated in ways designed to block the power or the influence of the democratic world. And the most clear and obvious place where that's happening is in Ukraine, where the Russians, together with using Iranian drones and North Korean troops and with access to Chinese components for their defense industry, have kept going a war that I think otherwise they would have had to stop if it wasn't for the assistance of this world. So you see them working together, and you see them also collaborating with people inside the democratic world as well.
So although they don't necessarily share a political ideology, do they share a view of being anti-West, anti-Western democracy? Is that one of the things that ties them together, which is a kind of ideology, perhaps?
Yes, I wouldn't say anti-West. I'm not sure that's the right expression anymore, but they're opposed to the democratic world. They're opposed to the liberal world. They're opposed to the rules and laws and norms of the world that the United States and Europe helped create after the Second World War. They would like to see the ideals of human rights overthrown, removed from international institutions. They would like to change the limitations that have been put on autocracies. I mean, Vladimir Putin says this very publicly and openly, and he also has demonstrated through his invasion of Ukraine that one of his goals is not just to make Russia an empire again, but also to prove that there are no laws, that he can invade another country, that he can kidnap Ukrainian children, that he can torture Ukrainians, that he can take over another state, he can force a change in language and culture, and no one can stop him, and no one can hold him to account. And that was part of the purpose of the war. It was to show that this system that was created, this idea that there are rules of international behavior, that this doesn't apply anymore. So yes, they are very much united around the idea that the Western world is their enemy, and and I should say there's a reason for that, because the language of Western or liberal democracy, the language of rights, the language of the rules of law, this is the language that's very often used by their own internal opposition, whether it's the Navalny movement in Russia or whether it's the women's movement in Iran. They use this language. They talk about freedom, they talk about rights, they talk about law. And this is the reason why the autocrats have begun to work together to push back against it.
And that causes problems, does it not, for institutions like, as you were saying that, the rule of law that they object to? It made me think of the UN Security Council, which has China and Russia on it. It's the sort of primary global rules-based, it's not a court, it's sort of a locus for them to have these issues debated. And two of the main figures on it are autocratic states that you're talking about, China and Russia. So they're both not only opposed to that sort of rules-based approach, they're also within it, which completely makes it impotent, I would imagine.
Yes, they've done a really good job of undermining the UN, which was never terribly effective to begin with, and making the UN Security Council almost useless. I actually saw a statistic recently. There have actually been no UN peacekeeping projects since 2014, and the last one was dealing with the Central African Republic. And at the time, even that was only possible because the Central African Republic was at that moment not really an important object of geopolitical competition. Actually, today, now it would be, because today there's Russian influence there, and there's been a Russian attempt to promote and reinforce the dictatorship there. But the UN Security Council is really no longer able to negotiate. It has very little impact. The UN itself has less and less ability to exert any influence on anything around the world. So yeah, that's one of the effects.
And I guess what follows from that, so I made that point to various leading politicians on the radio show I present. They effectively have to say, well, the UN doesn't work, but we can't really imagine a way of making it better. I mean, it is extraordinary that members of the Security Council don't have to recuse themselves in debating or vetoing or voting on things where they are the direct perpetrators. But that is true of China, is true of Russia, is true of America as well. I guess what follows, though, Anne, from that, because do we have to just admit that the world's systems can't cope? We can't cope with people who approach it in bad faith like an autocrat by necessity does.
We certainly can't assume that there are rules that don't exist. And I actually think that it's very dangerous to go on talking about a liberal world order as if it were real, and imagining that borders in Europe in particular are somehow, they're there on the map and they can't be moved, and because we've all agreed that it's a bad idea for borders to be moved by force. This is a very dangerous way of thinking. I think we need to understand now that there has to be preparation for someone to challenge borders. There has to be an understanding that people do try to undermine these rules, and that large states will try to dominate smaller ones. And we need to be prepared for it. Certainly in Europe's backyard, we need to be prepared for it, but we need to acknowledge that it will happen around the world. And beginning to accept that, I think, is the first step towards beginning to think about what kind of system could replace the one that we have currently.
Is your book and your thinking and what you're outlining here a kind of response to that notion of the end of history, that the world was going in a certain direction in which liberal democracy was more or less triumphing, the idea that rules were beginning to make, rules and capitalist-based rules were basically beginning to make the world a more, in inverted commas, civilized place? This is the kind of retort to that, isn't it?
Yes, I mean, actually, Francis Fukuyama, who invented the idea of the end of history and who wrote that book, did always say that something might come afterwards. In other words, that the end of history wasn't really the end of history. So to be fair to him,
He gets a lot of grief. He gets quite a lot of undue
does.
grief, doesn't he? Yeah, that's fair. That's
He
very
does.
fair.
He does. He does. But yes, I do think that it's funny. The reason that book was so widely misread was because it represented something that people wanted to believe. So people wanted to believe after the fall of communism, after the end of apartheid in South Africa, after the transition to democracy in Mexico and other places that took place in the 90s, I think there was a moment when people wanted to imagine that we had reached some kind of plateau where most countries were on some kind of path to democracy, where we could create a world in which we would be more and more integrated, and in which ideas about democracy would flow, as it were, from the West, in the old use of the term, to the East. We misunderstood several things that were happening along the way. One is that ideas are neutral, and ideas about autocracy could also move from the East, so-called, to the West. And I think we also misunderstood the degree to which our systems, our banking system, our financial systems began to accommodate and help the autocratic world, and in some cases help criminals stay in power. So as Russians began to steal money from their state, and they began to launder it and move it around the world, take it abroad, we enabled that. The city of London enabled it by allowing people to use the property laws to buy anonymous property. The United States enabled it. Western Europe enabled it. The Caribbean tax havens around the world enabled it. And those, of course, were often managed and run by British or American or European bankers and accountants. So we were part of enabling the rise of the autocratic state. And then as they began to be more wealthy and more powerful, much of their, what I would call autocratic behaviors, so the inclination against transparency and towards opacity, all of those things began to spread the other way around. And in many ways, you see the autocratic world influencing the democratic world and not vice versa.
I want to get to that in a moment because I think that's really interesting. Just finally on that point, Anne, this history of the 20th century, to a certain extent, the end of the 19th century, the whole of the 20th century, was a kind of triumph of capitalism, in the sense that capitalism made the world better. People got richer. People all around the world got richer. Living standards rose. Poverty was reduced. Absolute poverty was reduced. The argument that there's never been a better time to live than right now, which I'm sure still holds a lot of water as an argument. But what you're saying is that kind of that late capitalism also has fostered corrupt money, as well as money that's spread and trickled down and has benefited the world. It's also fostered the opposite of that.
And I would say that corruption is, and the growth of corruption and the complexity of the systems that have been created to enable corruption, both in the autocratic world and now in the democratic world. It's happening very spectacularly right now in the United States. That is going to be something that impoverishes people. I mean, whereas a period of growth and prosperity that we can identify in the 20th century did make a lot of people better off. We are healthier, we are wealthier than we were at an earlier stage of human history. I believe that the growth of kleptocracy, the spread of corruption, which is connected to the spread of inequality, although it's not the only. That's not the only source of it, is going to make people poorer, particularly because you now have the phenomenon of leaders of very large countries, Russia the most spectacular example, but there are many others, whose primary interest is not the prosperity of their own people. They aren't running their country in order to make people wealthier and make people better off, which is what we thought the purpose of politics was really up until now. But the purpose is to make themselves richer. And to enrich their families and people around them.
Hasn't that often been the case in human history, that you get rulers, you think of the sort of potentates and monarchs of the past who are interested in palaces and wealth and treasure? That's always been a part of human history.
It's absolutely been a part of human history, and I mean, most of humanity has been run by like that probably for most of history. But all of us, you and I anyway, were lucky enough to live in this democratic interlude when at least some of the time, some of the people who ran our countries were interested in making everybody well off or everybody wealthier or making life better for more people. And we had a spread of healthcare and we had a spread of education. And that was not accidental. It was connected to a democratic political system in which ordinary people had some ability to shape the kind of government that ran them. And what we're seeing now is an evolution in another direction, where we have not just in the autocratic world, but also in the democratic world, we have leaders who are now very clearly more interested in their own power and their own money than they are in their own constituents.
Well, let's talk about that because it feels that now is the time to enter the stage for one Donald J. Trump into our conversation. How far would you want to go to say that Trump is imitating the autocrats around him?
I think what's important to understand about Trump is that he made his career using the tactics and the methods of the autocratic world. So he's somebody whose business model, the construction of buildings in which people could buy condominiums, was partly designed to attract money from that part of the world. So something like a fifth to a quarter of the condominiums and apartments that were bought in his buildings were bought by shell companies. And that means these are anonymous companies. We don't know who the real owners are. Many of them are thought to have come from the former Soviet Union, from Russia, because that was where a lot of money was coming at that time. He's someone who liked and enjoyed contacts with that world and who from really the 1980s, sought to do business or to have associations in Russia. And this is not a conversation about any kind of secret links he had or some conspiracy theory about secret connections to the KGB. This was his open business model. This is what he said he was doing. And so he's someone who liked and admired the people in that world for 30 years. Whether it was Putin, whether it was Xi, he's somebody who's always spoken with admiration of people who rule without checks and balances, without restraints, without the bother of a free press, without independent courts, and without the rule of law. And you can see him now in his second term as president beginning to imitate that way of behaving and that kind of rule. So he's ruling through executive decree, essentially without Congress, very often issuing statements or decrees or making decisions that are illegal, in violation of the law. And what you're watching is the rest of the American political system beginning to try to catch up with him. The courts are beginning to rule against him. We don't yet have a majority in Congress that's willing to stop him, although they could in theory. But so far, we don't have Republicans who are brave enough to switch sides in order to put a brake on what he's doing. But is he does he see himself more aligned with the values of the world? Of that world, and does he identify with those kinds of leaders? Yeah, it's pretty clear that he does. I mean, this is what he says.
Do you think that's why he's ended up effectively espousing the Russian position with Ukraine, even as he pretends to be an honest broker? All of the lines that come out of his mouth at the beginning of the negotiation is to concede an awful lot to Putin, potentially just because he likes the idea of Putin and him sitting in a room carving the world up. And he might well say, I've got interests elsewhere in the world. I'm not that bothered about Europe. You take the bit of Europe you're interested in, Putin. We'll do a deal on various other things and we'll go on with our lives because this is the sort of deal, this is the sort of person I'm interested in working with.
I think that's part of the explanation, yes. And he has no attachment to the ideals or ideas of liberal democracy. He doesn't care what kind of country Ukraine is. He has no special fondness for Europe or for the alliances that made America so powerful over the last decades. He doesn't identify with the language that previous presidents have used when speaking about American alliances. All that is foreign to him. He's not moved by it and he's not interested in it. He very much does see the world as a kind of 19th century leader. I'm going to carve it up this way or carve it up that way. I can do what I want and nobody can stop me. I mean, I think actually he is beginning to discover that the world doesn't work that way and that Even the U.S. president isn't as powerful as maybe he imagined. But yes, his instincts are absolutely, his instincts and sympathy are with autocrats, with big countries that can do what they want with small countries, and the value of alliances, the value of international trade, the value of really of the world that America created over the last 70, 80 years. He's never understood that, and he doesn't care about it.
So it doesn't matter. I mean, this question often comes up to us. People get in touch with my program all the time and say, well, do you think he's been compromised by Russia? Has he? Is there a deal, a house deal from the 80s that compromises him? Have Russian money got into the Trump empire in such a way that he can't act impartially or even morally in regard to Russia? Do you think we actually don't necessarily need to believe that to understand his relationship with Russia?
I don't think there needs to be anything secret. I don't think there's something that we need to know in order to, some dark truth that we would need to find out in order to understand it. I think most of what Trump does and believes, he says in public. Most of his feelings about Putin, he's stated openly. His business dealings with Russia are a matter of record. They were written about extensively in 2016 and during his first term. It's all on the surface. If there is some secret relationship, that's great, but I don't think you need it in order to understand who he is or what he's doing.
So I want to try and pick about a paradox here with Trump, which I think is interesting. When you look at Xi or you look at Putin, they operate by suppression. They operate by, it's very much a top-down dictatorship, as you talk about, the autocracy. Trump is slightly different because he has his power because of animating a base of people. Now, he might animate a base of people through manipulation or through mistruths, but there is a populism about Trump that is not necessary for Putin because he controls the democratic and inverted commas system of Russia and it holds him in place. Xi doesn't need populism because he controls the country absolutely. Trump is not an absolute ruler. He's a ruler that uses populism, which itself, that is a distinction, isn't it? That's a distinction that's worth reflecting upon.
Oh, no. I mean, I didn't mean to suggest that Trump is an autocrat and America's a dictatorship.
But some people say he is. Some people say he is.
No. So it's clear to me that he would like to be, but I think it's important to look at, there's a scale and maybe a timeline here. Most of us, I think, mistakenly imagine that democracies fail because there's a military coup or there's a colonel who comes in and shoots up the White House, and that the end of democracy looks like some spectacular movie that we've seen. Actually, most democracies decline and most dictatorships are created nowadays by popularly elected leaders who come to power legitimately and have, as you say, a legitimate base of support, and who then use their power to begin to undermine the state. And so what you're seeing right now in the United States is not Putinism or Chinese communism. I mean, in that sense, it's a ridiculous comparison. What you're seeing is more similar to what happened in Hungary, to what happened in Turkey, to what happened in Venezuela. This doesn't necessarily require a kind of right-wing language to support it. It can also come from the left. You're seeing a popularly elected leader try to undermine the system. And in his case, the system was already weakened by his first term and by corrupt electoral laws going back many more years. So it's not as if he started from scratch. But almost every move that he's made, from the concentration of power in the hands of one person, from the emasculation of the legislature, from the verbal attacks on courts, from the attempt to use the law against journalists, against lawyers, against universities. I mean, all of this is stuff that we've seen before. So what you're seeing in Trump isn't dictatorship, but you are seeing someone who would like to what political scientists would call capture the state. So take over the state, and instead of the state being something that serves all Americans, make it into something that serves the interest of Trump or of his friends or of his political movement.
And what I think is so interesting, Anne, is that there's also another layer to that, perhaps, which is that there are a group of people all around the world now who feel that the state has never served all citizens. There's a disenfranchised movement of people who feel that the state has served the urban educated. It's served what they call the elite, the liberal elite. And you see it in Germany with the rise of the AfD. You see it in France with the rise of Le Pen. We have reform in this country. And that's a slightly different point, which is this idea that liberal democracy, or just democracy, was serving everyone's needs. And they said, well, hang on a second. If I'm poor and I'm not very well educated and I live in the provinces of my country, not the cities, I've been screwed over by politics. And actually, that's the base of people that forges the sort of populist who might well then come into power and want to unpick the democratic system, because that system to their supporters has been a failed system anyway.
No, I mean that's the ideology that motivates them. I mean, you've correctly identified it. I mean, the trouble with these modern so-called populist movements, whether it's in the U.S. or in Europe, or anywhere else, is they're bringing to power people who will, who will impoverish their supporters, and so will, people who are seeking to aggrandize more power, to keep it for themselves, or in the case of Trump and his movement, to use the state to enrich people around them, or to undermine the influence of voters. I don't think taking apart the U.S. healthcare system, or taking apart the U.S. education system, or ending, even firing, or ending the U.S. Park Service and firing large numbers of people from the Forestry Service, which is very important in places like Idaho and in the West, in states that support Donald Trump. I don't think any of these things are going to help those constituents and those voters or make them more included. So the formula that they're offering is not the one that's going to enrich or enfranchise the poor and excluded and the provincial. I mean, that's the real paradox of this moment.
And also, the other thing that connects people up to say Trump necessarily to someone like Putin is facts have ceased to matter. Because if you're in an actual autocracy or dictatorship, you can just control the media. You control the facts. You say black is white. You say you're rich when you feel poor. This sort of 1984 argument that you can just assert a reality and make that reality true. In a world of tribalism and social media away from an autocracy, you have the same sort of thing where ultimately if your person tells you this is better than you've ever had it, or this is better than you would otherwise have it, actual things like Medicare and things like that matter less because people believe an idea rather than a fact now.
So it's true that modern autocrats very often seek to shape the world to create an alternative world or an alternative set of facts that is more comfortable to them. And actually, in this sense, I'll say something different from what I said a minute ago. In this sense, there is a resemblance between what Putin did and what Trump did. Because actually, Putin came to power at a moment when he didn't control all the levers of the state and all the media. And of course, in some ways, he still doesn't, because people have access to YouTube, they have access to the internet. In the modern world, because of Soviet-style propaganda, where the party, there's one TV station and there's one newspaper and all the propaganda lines are the same, that doesn't work anymore. And so what you see instead in modern dictatorships, and this is true of Venezuela, it's true of Russia, it's true of El Salvador, it was true of Syria under Assad, is you see dictators who lie deliberately, and they lie constantly, and they lie repetitively all the time. And the goal is not necessarily to get people to believe the lies. It's not about believing Donald Trump when he says one thing or another. He says 1,000 things every day, or even believing Putin when he says one thing or another. Their idea is to pollute the information space altogether, so that people don't believe anything, so that they look at the public sphere, they hear all these lies being told. I mean, for example, a few days ago, Donald Trump said something about gas prices being lower than ever, petrol prices, as you would say, in the UK. And this is, of course, not true. And people who buy petrol for their cars know that it's not true. But when they hear those lies being told, their attitude begins to be one of deep cynicism. Okay, everybody's lying out there. I have no idea what's true and what's not. Therefore, I'm better off staying out of politics and staying home. And the purpose of of that kind of lie is to make people cynical and nihilistic, and to keep them out of politics. And that is what Putin did, and he did it very successfully. And I believe that's what Trump is trying to do. He wants people to be tuned out and confused and just to say, forget it.
And in some ways, it's taking what is a beautiful idea, the concept of doubt, which is one of the great human tendencies to question things. And, we be careful, we shouldn't idealize the past, where in previous autocratic states, where theocratic states, they say you can't doubt. I'm going to tell you what's true and you have to believe it or we'll punish you. The rise of doubt is actually quite a good thing, but it's maybe been taken to a pitch now where if you doubt everything, you don't believe anything. And what follows from that can be very scary.
What we created in the liberal democratic world over past 2 or 3 centuries was actually systems of almost institutionalized doubt. I mean, what was scientific inquiry? It was actually a nonstop debate. So scientists debating with one another about the nature of reality or what causes disease, or how you cure cancer. And they debated through this system of, we became more and more refined, scientific journals, and people would write something and then somebody else would quote. We understood science as something that was constantly evolving. It didn't ever have one single truth. I mean, it could establish some things as for the moment, unquestioned. As far as we know right now, this particular medicine cures this disease, and we can show you, and we can produce the scientific paper that shows you the study that shows that this is true. And then that was how truth became accepted. But a scientist who came along 10 years later and said, "Here's a better cure," or here's a different explanation for it, would also have a hearing. And those there something similar. I mean, it was a bit less efficient and messier and uglier. There was something similar that worked in the media. That the media was also supposed to conduct a kind of nonstop dialogue about the nature of reality and the nature of politics. Sometimes that worked and sometimes it didn't. What you're seeing now is something different. And so Trump isn't saying, I'm interested in what's the scientific consensus. He's saying, I'm going to hire RFK Jr., who thinks all science is rubbish, who doesn't care about scientific consensus, who doesn't think vaccines work, and I'm going to make him the most important healthcare official in the United States. And by the way, he's going to begin to take apart the scientific establishment, the public health establishment, and as a result of that, Americans are going to be sicker. So that's that's something that's different. That's not doubt. That's destruction.
Before I could talk about this for ages. Before I let you go, how gloomy are you then? We started out with this idea this was a gloomy answer to a question. Can this right itself? Because the more I sit and stare at this, the more I talk about it every day on Times Radio, I can't quite see a route out of this. There's a kind of council of despair that's starting to rise up. What's the answer here, Anne, if there is one?
So the only answer I can see is going to come about through the creation of coalitions. In the United States, if Donald Trump picks on a law firm, the only answer is going to be for all the law firms to begin to work together to push back. Internationally, if we have kleptocracy, if we have money laundering, if we have an explosion of dirty money, then we need a coalition of states who care about that problem and who want to work together to solve it. The autocrats work together. That's what we started out talking about. They have, they collaborate financially, they collaborate militarily, they collaborate in the realm of ideas. It's now really important that people who care about liberal democracy, people who care about freedom, people who care about preserving rights also begin to work together, whether that includes countries inside Europe and Canada and Asia, maybe working with the democratic opposition in places like Russia or China. Those are often the people who understand their own systems better than anyone else. It's through that kind of collaboration and through the creation of a kind of Democrats United as opposed to Autocracy Inc. That we have some kind of answer. And that to me is the only way we get out of this.
Will that happen?
It can happen. You can point to instances where it works. I can show you elections where you had a center right, center left cooperation that pushed back against authoritarian populism. That's the only answer.
It's interesting to see whether that will ever happen. You've diagnosed the problem brilliantly, and there is an answer there. Whether the globe takes it up or not, I suppose, is the question that follows. And what a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks a lot.
That's it for this week's episode of Thinkers. That was fascinating stuff, wasn't it? Please, big thanks to Anne, of course, and do leave a comment beneath the line. Respectfully, I know that you will do. Hit follow, subscribe, and stay tuned. There'll be more to come as we try and explore the ideas that mean something in this world. Thank you so much for joining.